thesis is titled At the Crossroads of Law and Literature. And I'd like to welcome our readers, particularly Professors Jane Ramirez and Aurora Lauzardo, and also anyone who might be listening in. Welcome to this defense. First, we're going to turn over the floor to Paula, who will give us a presentation on her work, and then we will have responses and comments from the readers, Professors Ramirez and Lauzardo. Thank you very much. So, Paula, I guess you can begin.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Barnes, Professor Lauzardo, and Professor Auerbach for taking the time out of your schedules to not only be here, but also for accepting to be part of my defense committee or for accepting to be my thesis director. I just wanted to say that I'm very grateful for what each and one of you has contributed to my life, personally and academically. And yeah, that's how I wanted to start off to get that out of the way. I'm very nervous. So if you see me stumble on my words, that is why. If you can wait a little, I will start presenting now. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, as Professor Auerbach said earlier, my thesis is titled At the Crossroads of Law and Literature. Professor had commented when I sent him the whole thesis at the beginning. He told me that not many people wrote or came up with a creative title for their thesis. So I was like, well, I'll give it a shot. These are two texts that are not from, these are individual texts. Like they were published independently, so they're not part of a book or the same publication, sorry. So I wanted to unite both source texts under one title. That just made sense, and that is why I kept At the Crossroads of Law and Literature as my title. Let me see if I can go, yeah. And this is the fully translated title, At the Crossroads of Law and Literature, Literary Creation, Crime and Law, Jorge Luis Borges and Emma Zunz, and Love and Interest, Property Law in Eugénie Grandet. As an introduction, I wanted to start off by saying or mentioning the merits and purpose for this thesis. I chose these source texts because I really enjoyed both literature and law, the literature and law analysis within these texts. And I really enjoy Borges on his own. And I had never read Balzac, so this was a very, very interesting and enriching and challenging task, but I really enjoyed it. Also, academically, I thought these texts were important in their own way because of said analysis of renowned writers of the literature of Argentine and French law, and yeah, as well as the personal aspect of the reason as to why I chose them, which was the challenge and the learning experience I could gain from doing it. Also, I had the experience of working and knowing the author before choosing to translate his work. And I thought that also was one of the main reasons as to why I chose these texts. A little bit about the author, Dr. Pedro Cabán Vales. He is an associate professor at the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico Law School. He has a PhD in law from the Complutense University of Madrid, a bachelor's degree and Juris Doctor from the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus, and he's currently completing a master's degree in comparative literature from the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus. He has various published works, not only the texts I translated, that focus on law and different jurisdictions that include the United States, Spain, and Puerto Rico. Going into a little bit about the source texts, the first one we're going to be talking about is Creación literaria, crimen y ley, Jorge Luis Borges y Emma Zunz. This article or essay was published in the Revista Jurídica of the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico School of Law, volume 54, in the 2019-2020 issue. The word count is of 6,523, including 63 footnotes. The Cabán in his text analyzes Emma Zunz, a short story written by the Argentine author Jorge Luis Borges, published in 1948. He also discusses themes of self-defense, premeditation, woman-centered narrative, and literary creation, as well as he examines, Cabán examines Argentine criminal law of the time to determine to what extent legal documents may have influenced Borges's writing in Emma Zunz. Cabán also incorporates and cites other legal sources within Creación literaria, crimen y ley, Jorge Luis Borges y Emma Zunz. The second text by Dr. Cabán that I translated is El Amor. Oops, this is, sorry. The little tab is interfering with my presentation, sorry. The title of the source text is El Amor y el Interés, Derecho, patrimonial en Eugenia Grandet. It was published by the Complutense University of Madrid Law School in the Revista de Ciencias Jurídicas y Sociales Foro, volumen 24, from 2021. The word count of this text was or is of 7,503, including 70 footnotes. Cabán in his text analyzes the novel Eugénie Grandet by French author Honoré de Balzac, published in 1833. It discusses concepts of civil and property law, such as matrimonial property regime, inheritance, mortgage, and bankruptcy. Cabán also examines or cites the civil and property law concepts within the Napoleonic Code of 1804, other literature, and other legal sources as well. And over here, I included little pictures of the publication. Now I want to talk a little bit about the writers and the literature that is within Cabán's essays. The first text that I translated is about, analyzes and discusses Jorge Luis Borges and Emma Zunz, his short story. A little bit about Jorge Luis Borges. Borges's father was a lawyer, and during his childhood, he developed a passion for literature within the walls of his father's library. And that is why it is believed that he was exposed to and influenced by law from a very young age. His works mainly explore the relationship between the author, the reader, and the texts, and they blur the boundaries between reality and fiction. And that is why I really, really enjoy his works personally. A little summary about Emma Zunz. Emma Zunz is a short story centered around the protagonist, Emma Zunz. Emma's father is falsely accused of a crime and committed suicide while in jail. Seeking revenge, Emma fabricates a story of being raped by a man she holds responsible, which is Aaron Lowenthal. She secures a job at Lowenthal's textile factory to get closer to him. After meticulously planning her revenge, Emma lures Lowenthal under a false pretext and shoots him, killing him. She stages the scene and successfully convinces the police of her innocence. And within the narrative, it is revealed that Emma's story was a complete fabrication. Throughout the narrative, she plans out how she's going to somewhat fool or convince the police that her story was her cover story, or her defense was plausible when it really wasn't. And she ends up deceiving the police. Now, talking a little bit about Honoré de Balzac, which is the author or the writer that is discussed in the second text that I translated from Cabán. Honoré de Balzac worked as a lawyer's clerk before becoming a successful novelist. A few years before the publication of his novel, Eugénie Grandet, Balzac was on the verge of bankruptcy and struggled with debt for many years. He therefore had personal knowledge of recurring themes within his works. I mentioned bankruptcy because bankruptcy is a concept and a theme that is discussed within Eugénie Grandet. That is one of the literature, the novel that is discussed in the second text that I translated. Balzac's writing style reflects the concerns of realism, and his works focus on social commentary on French culture and social norms. Eugénie Grandet, a little summary on this novel, delves into themes of love, greed, and the corrupting influence of wealth, presenting a vivid portrayal of a young woman's journey towards self-discovery and fulfillment within the constraints of society. The novel revolves around Eugénie, the daughter of a wealthy but miserly father named Felix Grandet, and despite her isolated existence, Eugénie maintains her kind-heartedness, her virtuousness, and intelligent nature throughout the entire novel. Eugénie falls deeply in love with Charles, her cousin, unaware that he is primarily interested in her wealth, which is something that many of the male characters, or the characters in general within Eugénie Grandet, were wealth was something that was very important to them. It meant obviously status, power, and I found it very, very interesting, this take. As time passes, Eugénie becomes the sole focus of her father's attention and manages the family's wealth wisely, accumulating a substantial fortune. And despite her growing riches, Eugénie remains humble and rejects suitors who are after her money alone. But then Eugénie is forced to confront the depths of her father's avarice once his health starts deteriorating. Other texts that or other documents that were included in the analysis and discussion within Cabán's source text that I translated were legal texts. In the text that is about Emma Zunz and Jorge Luis Borges, Cabán integrates the Argentine criminal law with the Criminal Code of Argentine Republic of 1887 and the Argentine Criminal Code of 1922. He integrates the Criminal Code of Argentine Republic of 1887 because he wanted to discuss or compare mainly the law that was enforced when the setting of Emma Zunz, within the setting that Emma Zunz transpires. And he also wanted to compare it with the Argentine Criminal Code of 1922 because that was the one that was in force when Emma Zunz was published. On the other hand, we have the French civil law that was discussed and analyzed within the second text from Cabán, which discusses Honoré de Balzac's Eugénie Grandet. In it, he discusses the Napoleonic Code of 1804. And now we're going into the most tedious part of the thesis. Everybody, I think, faces many challenges when tackling translations of any nature, really. And these are just some of the most that I encountered. One of them is the length of the source texts. The other is extensive research. The other is footnotes and sources, cited works without official translations, choosing the correct or most accurate legal terminology, and the inconsistencies within the official translations of cited literary works. The length of source texts was one of the challenges I could foresee since the beginning, because as I had already mentioned, the word count totaled 14,026. And this included the footnotes. And one of the requirements for this thesis is that the word count has to be between 10,000 and 12,000. So I had to resolve this problem to be able to translate these texts. And the way that I resolved this issue was by cutting out the English and Spanish abstracts, including footnoted information in the preface of the thesis instead of keeping the very extensive footnotes. And overall, at the end, the translation from Spanish to English was reduced to 12,786 words. Another translation challenge was extensive research, and I know that any translator goes through this extensive research phase, and it's not a phase, it's the whole process of translating is extensive research, consists of extensive research, and these were some of the things that gave me a little bit more work. Firstly, there were no official translations for most cited sources. The only texts that had official translations were Emma Zunz, Chess, Eugénie Grandet, the French Civil Code of 1804, the Napoleonic Code, Madame Bovary, Rise and Fall of César Brutau, and the Count of Monte Cristo. There were 23 other footnotes that I had to fully translate, not footnotes, sources, citations that I had to translate myself. And yeah, and for accurate and current renditions of legal concepts, terms, and phrases, I used the legal platforms of Westlaw, LexisNexis, and microjuris, and I also used JSTOR for reference as to academic articles and papers, and to see if these phrases or legal concepts were also used within those. Also, cited dictionary definitions in the source text were researched and cited from English dictionaries. Cabán in his work footnoted many definitions in Spanish from the Real Academia Española. So what I did was I researched the term that he was defining, and I found the translation for that term, the legal translation for that term, and I found and cited a dictionary definition for the English term. Also, another challenge was the original versions, as well as various published translation of the literary texts were consulted to compare and contrast, because the classic ones, Eugénie Grandet, for example, and Madame Bovary, those have many translations, and I went for the most traditional, the classic one, the oldest one, it was the oldest one. And so for various quotes, I found myself a little conflicted, so I decided to consult other translations to see how they had translated those same sentences or quotes, to see if they were a little more accurate towards what I wanted. I consulted the Spanish versions, the French versions, and the English versions. I as well consulted glossaries, articles, cases, books, official government documents, and web pages as well. Cited texts without official translations. Here I include two examples of how Cabán cited within his texts. Between both of Cabán's texts, 23 cited sources had to be translated. These citations are identified in the footnotes with translated source, which I will now be changing to translated by Latorre, or translation Latorre, by Jane's request. For these cited works, very little creativity was applied. The wording of the translation is not literal, though, but it is similar to as similar as possible to the original quote. Some sources were paraphrased by the author, and others were directly cited. Here I include one example of a directly cited source, and example number 2 is a paraphrased source. In the first example, Cabán writes, la defensa propia, también conocida como legítima defensa, fue definida por Sebastián Soler para la época en que se publicó Emma Zunz como una reacción necesaria contra una agresión injusta, actual y no provocada, con el propósito de evitar la agresión o repelerla. And my translation for this example, number 1, with the direct quote, is self-defense, also known as legitimate defense, was defined by Sebastián Soler at the time Emma Zunz was published as a necessary reaction against an unjust, actual, and unprovoked aggression, with the sole purpose of preventing or repelling the aggression. One of the struggles, a little struggle, was that in these types of citations, Cabán tended to include the direct quote within the flow of his sentence. So the challenge was to maintain the flow of the sentence as well as translating the direct quote in a way that was accurate. And yeah, that's why I put it as an example. The second example is the paraphrased source. This first example was from the Emma Zunz text, and this second example is from the Eugénie Grandet text, the second text. Cabán says, esta obligación se traduce patrimonialmente en el deber conyugal recíproco de utilizar los bienes respectivos para el levantamiento de las cargas del matrimonio, es decir, satisfacer las necesidades de los cónyuges y de los hijos menores de edad comunes o legítimos de cada uno. And in example number 2, my translation was, this obligation is translated materially in the spouse's reciprocal conjugal duty to use their respective assets for the upkeep of the financial burdens of marriage to satisfy the needs of the spouses and the common or legitimate minor children. Here I distinguished patrimonialmente and bienes because these are two terms that I will be discussing in the next few translation challenges, because legal terminology was confusing and it was a big part of as to why I had to do extensive research. Here we can see a good example where bienes is translated as assets, but we will see that bienes not always refers to assets. Sometimes it refers to property as well. In a legal context, I mean. And here we go to the translation challenge that required most research, the legal terminology. This challenge occurred predominantly in the text examining Balzac's novel and the French Civil Code, the Napoleonic Code of 1804. Most of the legal lexicon used comes from common law in the United States and England. Therefore, I mean, the lexicon that I used in my translation comes from common law and the United States and England. Therefore, some of these concepts from the French Civil Code do not exist within these jurisdictions, or they're not commonly used in legal documents. When choosing the most suitable rendition for a legal concept, the phrase or the term in English had to be used at least in 5 different documents. In most cases, it was used in many more, but this was the minimum I established for myself as a requirement when deciding on which term or phrase to use. Also, the context was also a very important element, as I already mentioned. For example, when they use in Spanish bienes, not always does it mean assets, or it not always means property. So the context was very important when to use each one and when they were used as synonyms, because that could also happen. When translating legal concepts, as already mentioned, and I keep mentioning, I'm sorry, extensive research had to be conducted in the following platforms. I used Westlaw, LexisNexis, JSTOR, and Graham Viewer, you name it. These were just a few I named. Also, Orellana's Glosario Internacional para el Traductor. This was a key tool as well. Thank you, Professor Auerbach, for suggesting to buy this in your financial translation course. It really has been an amazing tool for not only this project, but in your class and in other classes I took, and it really, really is very helpful. Here are some examples of terminology that I found challenging. There were many more, but these are the key ones, the most recurring ones, or well, the ones I found most tedious, I guess. The first one is régimen económico matrimonial, which I found marital property regime was the phrase that was mostly used in English and in many documents, legal documents, as well as régimen de comunidad legal, common property regime, was also, they had different ways of saying, naming or phrasing these concepts. So that is why the research came into play. But these renditions were the ones that were mostly used. According to bienes, assets and property, patrimonio, property, propiedad, property. That is why I also said that context was very important, because in Spanish you have so many different words for different concepts, legal concepts, and in English you have the same word for different legal concepts. They also had other words, but in the context, well, I had to decide to keep property. Because patrimonio, you can also say patrimony, but in English, patrimony is not that commonly used. Comunidad legal matrimonial, common marital property, patrimonio comunal, common property, and this last patrimonio y matrimonio, I put an asterisk on it because this was a title of a subtitle of one of the text of Eugénie Grandet. And while I was rereading my thesis, I realized that I had finally decided on property and marriage. And I had initially thought that property and matrimony was a little more accurate in terms of keeping a little bit of the wordplay here of patrimonio y matrimonio. But I ended up, and also I thought about patrimony and matrimony to keep the wordplay, but since patrimony I did not use throughout my translation, that is why I chose property instead of patrimony. And marriage I chose because I used the word marriage throughout the text as well instead of matrimony. So that is why it ended up being property and marriage and not property and matrimony. Here is an example of Ngram Viewer of one of the phrases I was talking about, common property regime and regime of common property. This is just an example of what I did for my research. Here we can see that common property regime is the most common and regime of common property is barely used. It exists, but it's barely used. And over here we have regime of common property in Westlaw and LexisNexis. We can see that it has been used in 5 sources, in 2 sources over here. So not that many, but it does exist. And in common property regime, we do see that it was mainly used and in the same context as in Spanish. And that is why in my translation, I chose common property regime as the the rendition, the proper rendition. And for the last, but not least, translation challenges, it was the inconsistencies I faced, I noticed when citing the official translations I used for the literary works that were cited within Cabán's texts. Legal terms within the official translations of Balzac's novels were very inconsistent, and this affected the register of my translation. The translation of the official translation could be considered outdated. It was translated by Wormley Prescott. She was a renowned, well-known translator in the 1800s. So yeah, it was outdated, but she made very, very beautiful translations when it comes to, when you see it as a literary piece. But when you sit down and you dissect these texts and from a legal standpoint, then that's when you see the inconsistencies. But yeah, Balzac really did use a lot of figurative language within his narrations, as well as legal language. So that is why I think Prescott's translation was the way it was. I did consult other English translated versions of the novels to compare and contrast, as I already mentioned. And I also consulted French and Spanish versions as well. Here I included two examples of what I meant, of what I mean when I say inconsistencies. In Balzac's French original version, you have these are the same quotes. The first example, the example one, is the same quotes. I have it in French, Spanish, English, and yeah. And the second quote is the same as the second in Spanish and English as well. And the words in question here, or the issue, was that, okay, Balzac in his French version uses faillite, and which translates to quebrar in Spanish. Like when you research the word in French, you research the definition, both in French or translated version of the word, it roughly translates to quebrar, or go bankrupt. And in Prescott's translation, she uses failing. But what happens? When I was researching, I found that failing is a synonym for bankruptcy, or bankrupt, and it does have a legal definition as well that could be considered accurate when referring to bankruptcy, quiebra, and faillite in French. So that is why I decided to keep her translation. Also, I really was, I faced like a like a translator block when I realized that these were consistencies that appeared multiple times within my translation, because when Cabán cites in his Spanish version, obviously he's citing these parts of the text because they have the legal term or the legal figure that he wants to discuss. within his text. So when I'm translating, I'm trying to keep that flow going. When I'm faced with these inconsistencies, I got very worried. And that is when I started to research other translations to see if they had translated it the same way as Prescott. But in other translations, I found that they did use bankruptcy or bankrupt. But doing further research, I ended up just accepting that failing might be is a synonym for bankruptcy. And well, yeah, you just have to look it up when reading this if you get confused. In the second example, we have crible, which is the word that is inconsistent. And in Spanish, it is translated as acribillado in Cabán's version. And the one that Cabán cites, acribillado a hipotecas. And in Prescott's translation, she wrote hampered with mortgages. And between Professor Auerbach and I, we both agreed that encumbered by mortgages is the way that it is said in a legal context. When you're referring to mortgages, you usually used encumbered by. But in a more literary way, I would have suggested to translate that as riddled with mortgages, because that's what I found that was the rough translation of crible. And that is it from me, from my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I will stop sharing now. Yes. Hi.
Okay, thank you very much, Paula. I was left with a couple of questions myself from your presentation, but I think it's really it's such a fascinating subject, because you have to go in so many different directions. But I'd like to pass over the floor now to our readers so that they can give their own comments and observations regarding your thesis as a whole. So do we have anyone who is interested in speaking first between Jane Ramirez and Aurora Lauzardo? Okay, Aurora, would you mind going first?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Paula, first of all, I would like to commend you for the enormous project that you faced and that you did for your thesis. I think it's a fascinating topic. I was very interested in the text. I like your title very much, and I agree with Professor Auerbach that sorry, we don't always get creative titles for our thesis. They tend to be very literal. So perhaps the combination, just because you were translating to text, you unified them beautifully in your title. And I would like to begin by telling you some things that I think you did very well. And then I have some suggestions. The texts are so fascinating, and not only what Cabán Vales writes, but also Borges and Balzac's tests are so interesting that I would like to say first that in your preface, I think that the way you justified your translation, and you have written some very beautiful phrases, and in my comments, I will send you the thesis after the defense. I say this is beautifully written and explained. So your preface is very scholarly. I think your approach is very scholarly. Your register is perfect. So in that sense, I like very much, and you did this in your presentation, the brief explanation on how Borges and Balzac, the relationship with law, right? And it gives a very good context for this for this translation and for this project. And also, I like, just to cite one, I like very much one of your phrases, although one might consider literature and law to exist in different realms, when combined, they create a written space in which social norms, as depicted in fiction, become brilliantly exposed. And I think you brilliantly exposed that yourself. And also in the paragraph, the following paragraph, I think you give a very good justification of why translate these two articles. So in that sense, I think you did a very good job, and I think your translation is very good too, in general terms. I loved the presentation that you gave us today. I loved it. I learned so much. And one of my comments, which is probably because I wanted more. I wanted to read more. I wanted to hear all these wonderful things that you said. I think that I found your preface a little bit short, and that it lacked a lot of this information about the research, about your decisions, how you decided to translate things. I think that what you explained about the paraphrasing and how to translate paraphrasing, and the two examples that you gave from Cabán's text, I would have liked to see that in the preface, because your presentation today, I think it's exemplary. What you just did now, I think it's fantastic. And when I read the preface, I was missing a little bit more of that information. I like it very much when students quote part of the text that they translate, and they present also their translation, because the preface should stand by itself. Remember that we do not publish the translation itself. What any reader of your thesis will see in our repositorio will be your preface. So in that sense, I feel that the preface that I read does not reveal all the work that you have done, which in this presentation is so brilliantly exposed. So if I could suggest something, and of course we are grading your thesis. I mean, today we're working with what you presented, but if you consider adding those slides, adding those examples, it's not rewriting the entire preface, but there are some things that could be added because they are fascinating and you explain them so well. So in that sense, I would say that this presentation, I'm in awe of this presentation. It's beautiful. One of the problems that I would have liked you to address in your preface and also in this presentation has to do with the translations, the English translations of both Emma Zunz and Eugénie Grandet. Because of course, I would agree that Andy Hurley's translation of Emma Zunz is a more than acceptable translation. It's a beloved translation also by us. But I am not so sure about the translation that you chose for Eugénie Grandet. I don't know if this is a scholarly translation as such, or I mean, if it is comparable, like for instance, to the Penguin translation that is available. How did you decide what translation to use for Emma Zunz?
Well, I mainly, when I researched the one from Prescott, Warmly Prescott, was the one that popped up more. So I thought that was the one that was traditionally used or universally used more or consulted more. And that is why. I also found in archive.org, when I was looking for different versions of Eugénie Grandet, that Prescott's translation was published a few times in different times. I think it was edited and republished. And it was the recurring one compared to the other ones. So that is why I chose it. When I started to encounter the inconsistencies, that is when I started to read the other translations and be like, wait, maybe I didn't choose the right translation. But yeah, I was well into my my own translation in that moment. So I was like, well, I'll just do extra research to see if it's like way off the way she translated some of these things. But when I researched the Balzac's version, French version, the word that he used, and the way that it is defined, the filiat, I think it is the word, quiebra, and then failing, what failing means in a legal context. And I was like, well, since they're synonyms, even though it's not used in legal context universally, it could still be used. It's not a complete aberración, if I could say it like that. And so yeah, that's how I got to choosing that translation.
Because I find it's very difficult, and I find it fascinating also that that Cabán is working with a translation, and then you're working with quotes from a translation, and you going into another language. So you have there quite a Torre de Babel going on, and maybe yeah, I wanted to know why you chose one particular translation over other options. Okay.
May I comment here?
Yeah, of course.
Because one comment that you'll find when you get my comments, Paula, is I commended you for what you said about that translator. I have it copied as Catherine, the other way around. You were saying Wormsley Prescott. I have it as Prescott Wormsley, and I must have gotten that from your thesis. So I think maybe you need to check to see whether you're consistent with her name. But besides that, I appreciated that, because as you were talking about the legal terms, I'm sure she did not write it thinking in terms of law. She was translating a novel.
Yeah.
And you called attention to that and honored her translation, despite the fact that it was not what you would have done with your legal knowledge. So, but I thought you did a good job of explaining the inconsistencies of her translation and that we could work with it. I will say that Andy Hurley piece, that one where he says at one time she thought for 1 second, I thought there's no way Andy Hurley wrote that. And I looked up unfortunately, my book is in a box in storage right now. I cannot get it out, but I had an online version that was supposedly Andy Hurley's, and it was different. I mean, it was substantially the same, but it was definitely different from that one that you quoted. So I don't know which one is the one that's actually from the book that was finally published. But I know if I could find my book, I mean, I could verify which one is the proper one. But I appreciated what you said about the translator, and I don't think anyone that you'd picked would have necessarily done what you'd have needed for this project anyway. But I agree, it was not an ideal translation for, but what are you going to do? Sorry for interrupting so extensively.
No. This is we always carry out these defenses like conversations, because, and I think that you explained it very well in your presentation today. There are some of my comments in the preface have to do with how did you decide this? Why did you choose this reference or this source in as opposed to others, right? And I think you did it beautifully in your presentation. So my suggestion would be, since this is what is going to be read by other people, and I think it's a very useful explanation of your process. I would add a little bit of that, because I found the preface that was not to be balanced between the Borges and the Balzac analysis. Like all of a sudden, it was finished, and I wanted perhaps to hear more about what you did beautifully in this presentation. So I would say that the preface could have used all of what you presented today. Two other things that have to do with the preface and with the rest of the text. I tend to suggest, and I tend to recommend students to divide the bibliography. The articles, the essays that you translated, they have their own bibliography. And I think they should be included. And of course, I know about the word count, but if you were to publish this, which is something that see if you can publish this somewhere, you would need that bibliography for each article. You cannot just send the articles with the notes, even if you write the entire title on the first note. You need the author's bibliography, and I would separate it from your own, because although of course you share sources, because otherwise you couldn't do the translation, I think that they should be separated, and that you should have a bibliography for your preface, and then the bibliography belonging to both articles. Okay. And the other thing is that, and I think I am channeling now, my dear Jane, is about the style manual, right?
Yes.
Because she has indoctrinated us.
Yes.
I think that I'm not sure about what style manual you used for the preface and even for the articles. Maybe you could explain a little bit.
I mean, I used MLA. That was the one I chose. Yeah, I guess that when I read a few examples of prefaces, and I wanted to make it a little more scholarly, the register. I didn't make it so personal. I think that's what you mean. Yeah, that's why I wrote it the way I wrote it. Maybe I could have been a little more personal with it. I could zhuzh it around for the final. No.
No, I think it's just that there's no
No, it's a style manual. Yeah, is it because you said you use MLA.
Mhm.
Sorry, but I wonder if for the type of journal in which these two articles were published, if MLA is the more adequate.
Oh, yeah, no, it
And
was a
even-
different format, yeah.
And even I found some inconsistencies in the footnotes, in the bibliography. So, and that's, again, I wanted to know why you chose, what style manual you chose and why.
Yeah, it was difficult to change the format because it indeed was not the same format as it was published. So yeah, trying to reformat those existing footnotes that were citations was very, very complicated. So I think that's where the inconsistencies come from. Yeah, that was a project on its own.
Is there a style manual that's particularly for legal texts?
Yeah, they use a different format. I don't know the name right now, which one it is.
One of my thesis students has talked to me about what she wants to use, and I think she called it the Blue Book.
Ah, yeah, this one.
So
Yeah,
I wondered whether that.
Yes, it is the Blue Book.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because we're working right now in a project that it's a leak. It's got a
And
lot
I
of legal.
have it and did not use it for this.
But there's just a lot of little things like where to how to put to format epigraphs. You know, those little quotations at the beginning. Like I've always taught, and my manuals have said, you don't put quotation marks with epigraphs, and usually you align them to the right.
Yeah.
You centered them and had quotation marks. Of course, you were following him. You were following your author. But there's things like that. Things like sometimes there's with the little superscript number, the call out number for the footnotes. Sometimes you had a space before it. Sometimes you didn't.
After. Yeah.
And there's just so many ellipsis points. Whether or not you can have ellipses at the beginning or at the end of a quotation, whether or not you should put them in square brackets. Those are all style manual issues where I can't say you did it right, you did it wrong. All I can say is check your style manual. And I typed check your style manual about 20 times in my comments. So
yeah, I just wanted to say that it might have been my fault as well for suggesting MLA because of the literary nature of these, since these are hybrid texts. And
yeah.
so, and the thing is, the Blue Book is not really going to deal with a lot of literary oriented issues. And so I think that these texts actually, they exist more, and I'm sorry, they exist more within a literary realm than they do within a purely legal realm. So that was my impetus, for suggesting MLA, because you can't use both, obviously.
No, and I don't care which one a
Yeah.
student uses as long as they've got one and they follow it.
Yeah, but it's something of a quandary. It is
Sure.
something of a quandary.
You're right.
And so I would not back down from Paula from MLA. But what you have to do is really, and these are, for example, what Jane just pointed out about the epigraphs, as well as, many other aspects. I think that you really have to be very thorough in going through it again with the MLA in mind. And maybe, sometimes ignoring what he does, for example, in that case.
Absolutely.
So, and also there should be a mention somewhere of what style, and that I think was the point that Aurora was making.
Yeah.
Not about your own style, whether it was being personal or scholarly, but what style guide you were using, because that is going to determine how the footnotes have to be formatted. That is going to determine so many different things. So, that it really should be mentioned somewhere. Or,
Yeah,
yeah, I'm sorry.
No, sorry. And But yes, I do agree with you that it's a quandary, because I saw this text published in literary review, in any literary review. So it is a hybrid of sorts, and I think that that as long as you stick to one manual and you state it, then all is well, all is well. But I think that, like, I agree with Jane in that sometimes it was not clear which style you were following. And yes, I probably would have recommended MLA too, because the blue book is not for this. The blue book is for coding laws, decisions, because and right now I am working recently with a translation with the blue book. So it's no, I mean, if you're going to cite Piglia, if you're going to cite all these literary scholars, well, the logical thing is that you use the MLA, you know. You want to go on, Jane?
What, are you done?
Well, I would like to converse with you and with Paula. So if you talk now.
Okay. Jane, would you mind taking the floor?
I've been revising mentally. I have a list here of things to talk about, and I've been revising it mentally. I certainly, well, I agree with Aurora and pretty much everything she said. I think you did an amazing job with all of that, with all of that legal terminology, with all the research that you did, with understanding some of it's because I have no background in law. Some of what Cabán wrote, I couldn't even follow. And so I really appreciate, I was kind of like in Eugenie's position when that slimy, what was he, notary was telling her that she knew they needed her signature, and letting her. Now, if any lawyer ever told me, don't read it, just sign it, that would be the end of that lawyer for me. So I was cringing. And I was also cringing when I saw those long, complicated footnotes. I had, my thesis was fraught with footnotes as well, encumbered with footnotes as well. So I know it's involved in the research and in formatting all of that. So your thesis was very readable. And I appreciated that, both the translation and your preface. When you get my comments, you're going to see a whole lot of comments and think, oh my, she thought it was horrible. No, I didn't. Just obviously, I'm primarily pointing out the things that you could work on. I do want to talk a little about the preface as well. I also found it good, but skimpy. Now, indulge me just a minute. I will get to the point, but I want to tell you my experience when I first really understood, when you first explained to me enough that I got the idea of what these texts were about. And then as I began actually reading this, what it did to me is it sent me right straight to my bookshelves. Because I said, oh, I know a bunch of books that ought to be his next one. Especially if he wants to get into English law, because my experience was, I was a reader from very young, like most translators, or can say the same thing. And before I was old enough to even be reading those things in grade school, I was pulling books off my parents' bookshelves and reading them. I read Jane Eyre like in 5th grade. And I read them as, I read Jane Austen as love stories. I read Dorothy L. Sayers as murder mysteries. I read the stories. It wasn't until I was much older and read them again that I saw the basis of law and economy, how much law and economy shaped the action in those stories. And I would love to go back, having read these two essays now, I'd love to go back and grab a couple of those and read them. And if Cabán wants to get into English law, I've got some authors that I would suggest to him. But see, I have just told you in 2 minutes more about my personal connection to these texts than you told us in your preface. That's what I was missing. I wanted to see what it meant to you. My French teacher in high school, and we're talking more than 50 years ago, so don't expect me to know much French, but my French teacher handed me her own copy of Eugénie Grandet. She wanted me to read it. I didn't have anywhere near enough French after 2 years of high school French to be able to read that. I don't know what became of it, but now I want to try again, probably in English or Spanish, but not French.
I don't recommend the translation.
Well, I'm sorry, I've got some, all right.
Which translation, the Spanish or the English? The English that you
The
use?
English one, the English one.
Oh, okay.
Maybe the Spanish one is way better. It is, I mean, from what I read, it was better.
I've never read Eugénie Grandet, but I've read other Balzac and Pierre Goriot, but and I always thought that that the translations were quite good in English, but I mean the thing is that when you go looking for certain things,
Yes,
it depends on.
That's when the problems can arise, and regardless of how well regarded or considered a translation is, when you get into the fine points and when you actually look, oh, here is this, then and you find that these things, well, yeah, and I mean I had said to Paula regarding this Wormley, but I don't think it's Wormsley, I think it's Wormley.
Yeah, it's Wormley.
I think there's no S in it. I don't think so. But when I mentioned, I said, well, she may not be very good with the legal terminology, and we do use failure for bankruptcy, but it's usually bank failure,
right?
Because you don't want to say bankruptcy. That's
right.
But what I was going to say is that since Wormley was more of a contemporary of Balzac, maybe there's more of a feel actually being a contemporary of what Balzac was about, that is very valuable, and that's something that I don't know enough about her and how well esteemed she is as a translator, but at least being more contemporaneous with Balzac may be actually a very good thing that needs to be considered as well. And I just wanted to make that point about that.
And that's initially why I chose that translation, because
well,
go ahead.
You can continue, Jane. Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I just want to finish because it has to do with a point that was made before by Aurora, and also I think that there has to be some kind of justification, maybe in your preface about why did you choose this this particular translation, and you may have to do a little bit more research on that.
Okay.
Well, while we're on that topic, I'm going to call her Catherine. That eliminates the problem of which way her name goes. So in Catherine's translation, she actually, I don't know if anybody else noticed it, but she actually added a line, and it was about a legal matter. She added a line in one of those quotations, long quotations, the conversation about signing the documents and so forth. I don't remember what it was because I was going to present that page and go directly to it. But at first I gave you a comment saying, I noticed that this sentence is, this phrase is not in this clause.
In the
It's
original.
not in the Spanish. But then when a few pages later, you gave us in the footnote, you and Cabán gave us in the footnote that passage in French. I know enough French and I know enough Romance languages in general that I could easily see that what she added was not in the French either. And yet I thought it was useful what she added, because it pointed out it was about something about the inheritance, and that about the inheritance from her mother specifically. That was a line that she added. I can't remember what it is right now, but I do have this written in the comments. But she added something, I think, to make it more explicit, plainer to the reader. I don't think it was something that Eugénie said. I think it was something that, what's his name? Crucial or something like that. I think it's in something that he said.
I'm trying
Where
to
that
look
she
for
was
it.
going to lose her mother's.
In
She
here.
would, if she did this, she was going to lose her inheritance from her mother. Now, maybe Crucial wouldn't have wanted to say that because he didn't really want her to be aware of that. But she added that information that would have been helpful to the reader. And just the very fact that it was legal really struck me. Well, anyhow, I'm going to go on with a few other things. I am going to present one page because it's going to say a little bit about, oh, and I really want to be able to compare those Andy Hurley translations of that one segment, because they were different from the one I've got. So I gave you a link in my comments, not here on chat. I gave you a link to the online version of the Andy Hurley translation of that paragraph. I don't know whether that's going to be useful or for anything or not, but I'm curious. I want to track that down when I find my book. So, but about what the preface, right before I share this one, I'm just going to share one page, eliminate a whole lot of stuff I was going to say. But along with what Aurora was saying in the preface, yes, this is all that future PGT students are going to see of your thesis. And it needs to be valuable to them. It needs to be something that they can follow on the argument and understand. I would really love to see at least one example from each of the texts, from Borges and from Balzac, of where the current law in their country affected the plot. I know it's hard to give one example without having to tell the whole life story of both ladies, but still examples and like when you say a problem of, I don't know how to translate this, well, tell us how, but she already discussed that. Yes, I agree. You answered something in your presentation tonight. I say tonight because it's dark, because we had a brief thunderstorm there. This afternoon, you added something that I had been wondering about. You had said that thing about, I need to have 5 sources. That's the established minimum. And my reaction was, says who? Who established this minimum? Is there some, well, you answered that now, and that's fine, because I thought it was, that seems like a reasonable criterion, that if you can find it in 5 different, as you listed 5 different law reviews that you found one term in, that was good.
As long as they're reliable, they have to be reliable sources.
Of course, yeah.
Oh, sure.
And not translations. Maybe.
Yes. And not for as useful as it is, not just Ngram Viewer either.
No, yeah, exactly.
Because my students forget, and I tell them every time we talk about Ngram view, where I say, don't just look at the graph.
Go
Go down to the bottom and look at the hits and see which ones apply to your context. And I find out that my students don't do that. It's work, but that's the way it is.
Extensive research.
Okay. But there's one other, just a really short thing I want to do it before I show the one text that I'm going to show, which is why did you repaginate for the two different essays, but yet you didn't start the footnote numbers over again? So we have each essay starting with page 1, but we have the second essay starting with footnote 68. Why?
I have no idea why it did not do the change, because David told me to do that, to repaginate, to break the
Which
page
I'm
number.
fine with.
And I thought that automatically the footnotes would break as well, but they did not.
No.
And I had no idea how to do that. I will have to find out how to.
Maybe there was a misunderstanding. What I said was that the preface had to be paginated separately from the rest of your text. The preface alone. So,
Okay, not the rest. Okay.
No.
Yeah.
So you don't have to separate the two of them.
Okay.
It's okay that you did, but that issue is something that was a mechanical issue, Jane, that happened at the very.
Oh, I figured. I just wondered.
At the very end, and so.
Okay.
But you just have to separate the preface, which has to be Roman numeral pagination, from the rest of the text. That was what I was
Okay.
emphasizing.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm going to show one page from your preface. And it's a grammatical error that you made, but I'm not showing it for the sake of the grammar. I'm showing it because of my curiosity and even concern about the reason for it. I know I'm being mysterious. I don't mean to be, but it's easier to show you than to tell you. Because this particular error, which is dangling modifiers, this particular error occurred 6 or 7 times in the 9 pages or so of your preface, and only once or twice in the 40 pages of your translation. So it's not a thing you do by nature. It's something you did in your preface. So I'm curious about it. So I'm going to show this one page. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
All right. So we have this here. The merits of the translating these works are mainly academic, but also personal. See, you said that this is personal, what you're writing right now. This is the preface. This is page 7 of the whole document, and that includes the front matter. So it's like the second or third page of your, of your actual preface. But then you wrote this sentence: as someone with a bachelor's degree in English literature and a third-year law student. Now, I assume you're talking about yourself, yes?
Yes.
Okay. These essays are the ideal combination of 2 fields of study that offer incredibly interesting and significant content. I suggested calming down the incredibly. It's not incredible, but it's not just very either. Find a word in between, but whatever. That's unimportant. I just thought you were probably curious about why it's in yellow. But here, as someone with a bachelor's degree in English literature and a third-year law student. Okay, who is this person? I'm speaking grammatically. Who is this person with a bachelor's degree? And the first thing I get is these essays. These essays have a bachelor's degree? I don't think so. So it looks to me, because there's another 5 or 6 of these. It looks to me like you're knocking yourself out to not say I.
Yeah.
because the obvious way to do this is as someone with a master's degree in English literature and a third-year law student, I found these essays to be an ideal combination. But you didn't want to say I. Now you did say I
did,
once
yeah.
and me
Once.
once. Why? Why are you being so careful to?
Again,
This is-
for the scholarly register, I wanted to do. But if I rewrite, I mean, if I edit this with all of your suggestions, I will probably will rewrite this whole thing and make it a little more personal.
Well, it
reads better.
It
It
can
reads-
be personal and scholarly.
Yeah.
And that the preface is a kind of a personal document. How much you want to tell about your personal story of how you found, I mean, I'm curious about how you found these texts. Were you looking for something? Did he suggest them? Did you stumble on one and then wonder, are there any more like this, and start looking it up? Or, you know, I'm curious about all kinds of things, but you can tell that story or not. But you can't get by with writing a bunch of dangling sentences that start out with dangling modifiers just because you don't want to say I. And there are ways of fixing it. And you did it at the end of your preface. You used the translator. I don't particularly like it, but you can talk about yourself in third person if that makes you more comfortable. You don't have to do it in my favorite style. But don't be afraid. There's nothing wrong with adding an I in there. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want every sentence to be I this and me that, but I'd like to see it a little more personal and grammatically correct, of course.
Okay.
So I've marked them but like I said, there were only a couple of them in the translation. So it's not like you have a writing problem here. It's just something that, and we all do it. So, well, I shouldn't say we all. I occasionally mess up and do it myself. So you do see what's wrong with it, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay. All right. So there's a lot more I wanted to say, but I think we've talked quite a bit. Just one more thing. In the Eugénie Grandet, I practiced all afternoon on how to say that in French. So that's what, if I'm saying it differently from the rest of you.
It's Eugénie Grandet.
Grandet. And yet on YouTube, one of the videos said in English, it's Eugénie Grandet.
Grandet.
So I thought, okay, whatever. I'm sure there are many English speakers who do say exactly that. But anyway, there's one point of law in which it talks about if one of the spouses dies before the other, then what happens with the money. And you kept saying the widower. Well, I know in this case, we were talking about a widower. But I don't think you can do that when you're talking about the law, because it worked both ways, right? If either spouse dies, then the one remaining, regardless of what the rights are, and I don't want to get into that, but the one remaining is the one we're talking about. I think you need to say that either the widow or widower, or widow parentheses ER parentheses, or the widowed spouse.
The widowed spouse.
That would be my top choice, the widowed spouse.
Yeah.
I think that's the way it would be stated in law.
I agree.
I think it's easy, and it's here again, this is this literature and law dichotomy here, that trying to blend two things that don't really mix very well. The characters that we were talking about, it was the widower, but I guess it was supposed to be her widower, and then it worked out the other way. But it's easy to get caught up in that and And it just says viudo
Viudo.
in, or maybe the verb, maybe the participle version of it in Spanish. But anyway, widowed spouse. This was, I really got into this one. I liked this a lot. I thank you for bringing this and
I'm
for
glad you
translating it
enjoyed
so
it.
nicely.
You
I
all
did.
enjoyed it.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment that appeared in the presentation. And if you're going to include it in your preface,
Mhm.
you mentioned patrimonio, and that it can be translated as property or patrimony, but it does have other translations.
Mhm.
Inheritance and estate as
Yes.
well, and heritage. So those are, and those, so this idea of kind of giving the limitations of the English language, I wouldn't say that's really true, because patrimonio, every language has its limitations, and that's not the point. But if you're going to use that as an example, you should use the other translations, which in many legal contexts would be absolutely legitimate. Even in this case, estate or inheritance could have applied depending on some other context. So,
Yeah. I was going to mention that. Yeah, that depending on the context. Yeah. When I was explaining that, I just went on with what came to my mind in the moment, because I did not.
I just wanted to
But yeah, I completely agree.
clarify that. Okay.
And the other thing on that page that I just now closed accidentally, without thinking, was about the translated source.
Yeah.
And for the sake of those listening, I think it's really important to make it clear when the translator is stuck with translating a quotation themselves because it doesn't exist in a published version, or the published version doesn't work or something. It's important to make it clear who did that translating, not necessarily to brag, although there's no reason for not bragging about it, but not necessarily for that reason, but as to be intellectually honest, to make it clear that with whoever is reading it, who it is. So I think the simplest way is when you translated something, then in your square brackets that show that the translator is saying something that wasn't in the source text, you put your name. Just say translation and your name, Latorre. You don't have to have your whole name and your college degrees and all that kind of stuff. Just make it clear who did that. So
Yeah, just translation Latorre, that would be fine.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That's how I have it.
Torre. Latorre Arroyo, because someone might, just to be clear, just to be very clear.
I just figured her name is already, or had better already be on when it's being published. And if ever your translation is published, you make sure that they know that your name should be on it as translator too, because they don't always automatically. So your contract, you write that in.
Yeah.
That's what Andy Hurley told me to do. So he was my thesis advisor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's why you have the book that you're.
Yes, I have that book autographed.
Wow.
I was gonna go looking for, but I didn't want to take any time. And I have an earlier translation of that as well. So I'd be very curious to see, what differences there are. Anyway,
David, I'm sorry, did Gregory Rabassa translate also this story?
That's a good question. I know that Rabassa worked with him on, I think it was the poetry project though, but
Okay.
Well,
I have to check that.
Just curious.
I'm not sure you can even find those anymore because of the estate issues that Kodama you know, actually eliminated all other, you know, she put a ban on later editions of anything that was not translated by Hurley.
But my understanding from when Andy translated that is that he was hired to translate hired by the estate to translate all of the fictions. That somebody else was doing all the nonfiction and somebody else was doing all the poetry. And the book that I have, which actually is one of the ones that the publisher sent him, and he gave it to me. So that's a surprise possession. Well, I've got to find it. But it's just the fictions. It's the collected fictions.
Yeah, but there was an earlier version that was called Ficciones.
Okay, that
is a collection. Ficciones is one collection of Borges.
I saw that
stories.
yes.
Yeah,
okay, I'm going to have to. All right, I'm spending.
It's called Ficciones. I have to find it. I have to find it.
Yeah, me too.
I was just curious. Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, so I think we're ready then.
This was a very enjoyable discussion and conversation. Thank you, Paula, for providing us with this opportunity. I have enjoyed so much, really.
Me too.
So much.
Thank you.
That's partly because we professors don't get together face to face very often anymore. So
it's also because we have very little time to read literature.
I want to read Eugénie Grandet now, but
yes, I do too. But it's on a long bucket list. Let me tell you, of all the things that I never get to read. Okay, so are we ready to exile Paula for a short period of time?
Yes.
Okay, Barbara, I'm not sure if you're there. Paula Latorre Arroyo. We discussed the translation and the preface. And first of all, so you don't have to wait anymore, you've done a really great job. So we feel that you deserve a sobresaliente. And we'd like to congratulate you on that. Thank you. The translation is beautiful, and it's of such a complexity, such difficult work, and all of the research that you did, which is now very clearly evidenced, more clearly evidenced. It's really commendable. What we would like you to do is to include.
Excuse me. I really apologize for interrupting, but my laptop is blinking. I'm going to be gone in a moment. If you want a picture with me in it, you better take the picture because I'll be gone. Sorry.
Okay. Can we take a photo? Can someone take a photo?
Let me see. Barbara is not there.
I mean, I could take a screenshot.
Yeah, I'll ask you guys to please smile and I'll take the screenshot. We have it, so you may conclude and then we'll finish the live stream.
Okay. Anyway, congratulations. We feel that you should include especially some of the stuff that you had toward the end of your presentation. And also you will be getting the comments from Jane and Aurora. You have approximately, I think you have a month to submit this, Aurora, is that, or no? Is it sooner?
Aurora, you're on mute.
Sorry. Paula, ahora mismo no sé exactamente la fecha, pero no es tanto, porque para que entre el grado, para ahora, creo que yo te mando la fecha por email.
Okay, hasta que no le entregue, no me dan el grado.
Sí, lo que pasa es que cuando entregas nosotros ahora vamos a tramitar todo tu certificación de grado y todo. Quizás podemos ya apagar el live o sí. Pero bueno, para tenemos todo listo y cuando entregas la tesis, porque la tesis tiene que entrar en el repositorio para que se te pueda certificar
Okay.
el grado.
Barbara, can you